Picture this. You wake up tomorrow morning, and every single glacier, ice cap, and frozen sheet on Earth has completely melted overnight. From Antarctica's vast ice shelves to the frozen peaks of the Himalayas, from the Arctic Circle to Greenland's glaciers, all of it gone in a single day. It sounds like science fiction, but if it happened, the world as we know it would be unrecognizable. The first and most obvious impact would be a dramatic rise in sea levels. Scientists estimate that if all the ice on Earth melted, sea levels would rise by more than 70 meters, or about 230 feet. Imagine iconic cities like New York, London, Tokyo, and Shanghai, all underwater. Entire nations such as the Maldives, Bangladesh, and parts of the Netherlands would vanish beneath the ocean. Billions of people living in coastal regions would be displaced instantly, sparking the largest human migration in history. But the catastrophe wouldn't stop with rising seas. Melting ice would release massive amounts of fresh water into the oceans, disrupting the delicate balance of Earth's climate systems. The ocean's currents, particularly the Gulf Stream, which regulates weather patterns in Europe and North America, would weaken or even collapse. This would trigger extreme weather events. Europe could freeze, while regions in Africa and Asia might face unbearable heat waves and droughts. Storms, hurricanes, and monsoons would grow more violent, fueled by the destabilized atmosphere and warmer oceans. Wildlife would also be devastated. Polar bears, penguins, and countless species that rely on ice environments would face extinction. Entire ecosystems that depend on cold climates would collapse. Meanwhile, diseases frozen in ancient ice for thousands of years could be released, reintroducing pathogens that modern humans have never encountered before. This wouldn't just be an environmental disaster, it could become a global health crisis. And then there's the human cost. Coastal megacities would be wiped out. Economies dependent on ports, fishing, or agriculture near rivers and coasts would collapse. Nations would face food shortages, economic chaos, and mass unrest as billions of people fight for survival in a world that has shrunk dramatically. Wars over fresh water and habitable land would almost certainly erupt. The sudden disappearance of ice would also alter Earth's reflectivity, known as albedo. Ice reflects sunlight back into space, keeping the planet cool. Without it, Earth would absorb far more heat, accelerating global warming even further. This runaway effect could push temperatures to extremes, making many parts of the world uninhabitable. In just one day, Earth would plunge into chaos, reshaped forever by the loss of ice. Civilization would be forced into a desperate struggle for survival. But this is only the beginning of the story. The ripple effects of such an event reach deeper than most people realize, and the world that emerges after the melting would be a planet unlike anything humanity has ever seen. If all the ice on Earth melted tomorrow, humanity wouldn't just face rising seas and violent weather. It would be forced to rebuild civilization in an entirely new landscape. Picture vast areas of land disappearing overnight, submerging ancient landmarks, modern cities, and entire cultural histories. The Statue of Liberty, the Pyramids of Giza, and even the Great Wall of China would find themselves swallowed by the ocean or stranded in hostile, reshaped terrain. Humanity's heritage, like its homes, would drown. The sudden flood of seawater would overwhelm infrastructure everywhere. Highways, airports, subway systems, and power grids in coastal regions would be destroyed. Freshwater supplies would be contaminated with salt, leaving billions without drinkable water. Croplands that once fed entire nations would vanish beneath the sea, wiping out food security in an instant. Farming would be forced to move inland, but fertile land would be scarce, triggering fierce competition for resources. Mass migration would become inevitable. Billions of people fleeing submerged countries and regions would seek refuge in higher altitude areas. Cities in the mountains, places like Denver, La Paz, and Kathmandu, would explode in population, becoming overcrowded hubs of survival. Governments would struggle to provide shelter, food, and safety to the flood of climate refugees. Social tensions, already stretched by fear and scarcity, would ignite into conflict. Borders might close, wars could erupt, and humanity would experience one of the darkest humanitarian crises in history. But even those who escaped the flooding would face new dangers. The rapid melting of ice would disrupt tectonic stability, as the weight of ice that once pressed on Earth's crust is suddenly gone. Scientists believe this could trigger earthquakes and volcanic eruptions in regions previously stabilized by massive ice sheets. Imagine not only rising seas, but also catastrophic eruptions and quakes shaking a planet already in chaos. And then comes the atmosphere. With no ice reflecting sunlight back into space, Earth's temperatures would surge. Deserts would expand, swallowing up fertile lands in Africa, Asia, and the Americas. Rainforests like the Amazon would face droughts and mass die-offs, releasing even more carbon dioxide into the air. This feedback loop would accelerate warming until much of the planet became hostile to human life. The melting would also reshape oceans in terrifying ways. As freshwater floods the seas, salinity levels would drop dramatically, destabilizing marine ecosystems. Fish populations would crash, devastating one of humanity's most vital food sources. Coral reefs, already endangered, would disappear entirely. Rising ocean acidity and warmer waters would make much of the sea a dead zone, uninhabitable for marine life. The oceans, once the source of abundance, would become a graveyard. Yet amidst the destruction, human innovation might emerge. Faced with extinction, people would be forced to engineer radical solutions. Floating megacities, artificial islands, and giant domes to protect inland populations. Technologies that seemed futuristic, such as genetically modified crops that grow in saltwater or large-scale desalination plants, would suddenly become humanity's lifeline. But would these desperate measures be enough to save us from a world transformed overnight? In the aftermath of such a cataclysmic event, humanity would be faced with a fundamental question. How do we survive on a planet that has been reshaped beyond recognition? The answer would not be simple, because survival would depend on a mix of adaptation, cooperation, and ingenuity at levels we have never achieved before. The first priority would be resettlement. With entire coastlines gone, billions of people would move inland, forming massive new population centers. These cities would need to be built rapidly, using advanced engineering and resource sharing. Skyscrapers would rise in areas that were once sparsely populated, and nations would be forced to collaborate, or compete, over who controls the last safe, arable lands. The struggle to establish order in such chaos could either bring humanity together or tear it apart. Meanwhile, technology would become humanity's greatest weapon in the fight for survival. Floating megacities, once a concept in science fiction, would become reality. Nations might build enormous platforms on the ocean, capable of housing millions of climate refugees. Others might retreat underground, carving out self-sustaining cities protected from the extreme weather above. Agriculture would shift to vertical farms and lab-grown food, as fertile farmland becomes scarce. Desalination plants would multiply, turning seawater into fresh water, though never fast enough to meet the overwhelming demand. But technology can only go so far. The psychological toll of losing so much so quickly would weigh heavily on humanity. Imagine millions of families watching their homes, schools, and communities vanish under the waves. Imagine cultures losing centuries of history, as entire nations are erased from the map. Trauma would become as widespread as hunger, shaping a generation that has known nothing but struggle and displacement. International relations would also face unprecedented challenges. Countries with higher ground and safer climates would become the new centers of power. Regions like Canada, Scandinavia, and Siberia could become havens, while much of Asia, Africa, and the Pacific would drown. The balance of global politics would shift overnight, leading to new alliances, rivalries, and wars. Human survival would depend not only on physical adaptation, but also on the willingness of nations to share resources, accept refugees, and prevent global collapse. Amidst this chaos, however, opportunities for renewal could emerge. A planet stripped of its ice would be terrifying, but it could also push humanity into a new age of unity and progress. People might finally set aside petty differences, realizing that survival depends on working together as a single species. Breakthroughs in science and technology could accelerate, leading to innovations that not only save humanity, but prepare us for life beyond Earth. Colonization of other planets, long considered a distant dream, could become a necessity for survival. In the end, a world without ice would be unrecognizable. The seas would swallow our coastlines, the climate would spiral into extremes, and humanity would be forced into the greatest struggle in its history. Yet within that struggle lies the potential for rebirth. Whether we collapse into chaos or rise into a new era would depend on one thing: our ability to adapt, not just with intelligence, but with compassion, cooperation, and resilience. Because survival in a melted world would not belong to the strongest, it would belong to those who can rebuild together.